Rachel knew something was wrong the moment she crossed the door. The air felt different there, heavier, as if the house was breathing along with her. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just the darkness lurking in the corners or the heavy silence of the mountains. It was the undeniable feeling that somewhere, something invisible was watching. Something that wanted more than just her presence. It wanted her mind. David's car crept slowly along the narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest in the mountains of Maine. The sunlight barely penetrated the tall trees, casting long shadows on the asphalt. Rachel, sitting in the passenger seat, watched the treetops with a growing tightness in her chest. It felt like the forest was closing in on them, pushing them toward a dark fate she couldn't explain. David was excited, almost carefree. To him, this was the perfect escape from the city, from the stress and the memories they both needed to forget. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, something beyond mere anxiety. It was as if the air had thickened, laden with a weight she couldn't name. "Are you okay?" David asked, taking his eyes off the road for a moment to look at her. "Yes," Rachel replied, but the discomfort in her voice was noticeable. She instinctively touched her stomach, the place where, months ago, her baby had grown and disappeared. It wasn't something she could erase, and this house, this new house in the mountains, was the fresh start David kept talking about, the chance to leave the past behind, or at least, that's what he believed. Finally, the house appeared, emerging between the trees like a dark figure against the gray sky. It was an old structure made of dark wood that seemed to have absorbed years of rain and solitude. The windows were large and opaque, like veiled eyes watching the two newcomers. David parked the car, smiling as if this was the beginning of a new adventure. "Here we are, our new home." Rachel got out of the car slowly, feeling the cold mountain air wrap around her body. The house seemed to breathe with her, as if the air itself was denser, thicker, around every inch of her skin. The silence was unsettling. There were no birds singing, no distant sound of wind through the trees, just emptiness. "It's bigger than I remembered," she said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But her tone faltered. David didn't notice. He was busy admiring the property around them. He walked to the front door with the keys, motioning for her to follow. Rachel hesitated for a moment, staring at the house as if it could somehow swallow them whole. She took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. Inside the house, the air was even thicker. It smelled of old wood and dust and something else she couldn't identify. Something metallic. A shiver ran down Rachel's spine. She looked around, trying to ignore the growing feeling of claustrophobia. The house was spacious, but it felt suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in on her. David continued exploring the rooms, excited. "You're going to love it here," he called from somewhere distant in the house. Rachel didn't answer. She was standing in the center of the living room, feeling that presence. It was as if the air was watching her, wrapping around her in a way that wasn't natural. Something in the house wasn't right. She turned toward the front window. Outside, the world seemed peaceful and still, but inside the house, something was waiting. And Rachel, without understanding why, knew that it would not leave her alone. The first few days in the new house were spent organizing and making small repairs. David was enthusiastic, exploring every corner, while Rachel tried to adjust to the place. However, the discomfort she felt the moment she crossed the door didn't go away. On the contrary, it seemed to get worse every day. At first, she tried to ignore it. She thought the weight in the air was just a result of the altitude or the damper mountain climate. But the feeling was always there, constant and oppressive, like an invisible hand pressing on her chest. At night, it was worse. Rachel would wake up in the middle of the night feeling as if the air around her was too dense, making it hard to breathe. "Are you feeling better?" David asked one morning as they had coffee in the kitchen. "You seem tired." Rachel looked at him, unsure of how to explain what she felt. How could she say that the air felt heavier? That she sensed a suffocating presence around her? Something she couldn't see? David was already worried enough about her well-being since the incident with the baby. She didn't want to worry him even more. "I'm fine," she answered with a forced smile. "I think I just need to get used to the altitude." David nodded, satisfied with the explanation, and went back to talking about the renovation plans for the house. Rachel tried to focus on what he was saying. But the feeling of suffocation only grew. It was as if something was wrong with the very air in the house, as if she was inhaling an invisible heavy substance that was weakening her more each day. At night, while David slept soundly beside her, Rachel suddenly woke up, her heart racing. The room was dark, except for a faint beam of moonlight coming through the window. She looked up at the ceiling, breathing heavily. The air seemed to close in around her, denser, heavier. It was as if an invisible hand was pressing on her chest, preventing her from breathing. She sat up in bed, gasping for air, trying to pull it into her lungs. Everything around her was too quiet. Her gaze wandered around the room until it landed on the slightly open door leading to the dark hallway. A soft breeze blew through the gap, and Rachel felt something even stranger. The air seemed to move as if it were alive. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. It's just your mind playing tricks, she thought. It's the stress, the exhaustion, there's nothing wrong here. But even with her eyes closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that shouldn't be there. When sleep finally returned, it was restless, filled with strange dreams, shadowy figures moving around the room, formless shadows breathing along with her. Upon waking, however, Rachel couldn't remember the details. She only knew that something was deeply wrong. The next few days passed slowly, and Rachel began to realize that the discomfort wasn't just physical. It wasn't just the heavy air that bothered her, but something more subtle. Something she only noticed one afternoon while she was home alone. David had gone out to buy construction materials in town, and Rachel decided to stay, trying to organize the house. She was in the hallway, folding clothes in the guest bedroom, when she heard it for the first time. A soft whisper, almost indistinguishable, coming from somewhere inside the house. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. After all, she was tired and maybe a little paranoid after so many sleepless nights. But then the whisper came again, a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to come from far away, as if it were on the other side of the walls or in the air. Rachel froze in the middle of the room, stopping her folding. She stood in silence, waiting to hear the sound again, and it came, this time clearer, as if someone were calling her name. Rachel. She dropped the clothes on the floor and looked around, but the room was empty. The sound was soft but undeniable, a voice floating in the house as if carried by the very breeze coming through the windows. Rachel's heart began to beat faster. Her first instinct was to run outside, but something held her back. Something inside her wanted to understand what was happening. Logic insisted it was just the wind, or some kind of echo from the mountains, but her instincts screamed that something was very wrong. She took a deep breath and left the room. Walking slowly down the hallway, as she approached the stairs, the whisper returned, closer this time. The voice sounded like a lament. A long, sad whisper. Rachel gripped the handrail tightly, feeling cold sweat on her palms. She stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at the lower floor, where the living room opened darkly before her. The sound was louder now, as if the air around her was filled with laments. Something was calling to her. Something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't exist. Rachel. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound. Maybe she was going crazy. Maybe all of this was a reflection of the trauma, the stress still suffocating her, or maybe it was real. When David came home that night, Rachel tried to tell him what she had heard, but the words came out jumbled, and he quickly dismissed the matter. Rachel, it's just the mountain winds. It could be an animal, or even the sound echoing through the forest. I told you the place is old. It makes noises. Don't worry about it. He hugged her, trying to comfort her, but Rachel couldn't feel safe. It wasn't just the wind, and she knew it. In the following nights, the sound persisted. Sometimes she heard the whispers while washing the dishes or tidying up the cabinets. The voices, initially just murmurs, began to form words, still disjointed but unmistakable. It was as if the house was trying to speak to her, or maybe as if something that inhabited the air inside was struggling to be heard. The feeling that something was deeply wrong with the house never left Rachel. The whispers became part of her routine, always lurking, always on the edge of perception. She avoided mentioning it to David anymore, as he had already shown weariness with her concerns, but she knew she needed to understand what was happening. One afternoon, when David had gone out to town again, Rachel decided to investigate. Something inside her told her that the answers were somewhere, perhaps hidden in the old details of the house or in the records of the small town where they lived. She went to the local library in Millinocket, a small town that seemed lost in time. The building was old, with dusty shelves and few people. Rachel wasn't sure where to start. but she asked the librarian if there was anything about the history of the land in the mountains. The woman, an elderly lady with tired eyes, raised her eyebrows as if it wasn't the first time someone had asked about it. The house in the mountains? The woman hesitated. I've heard there are things up there. Old stories. But you're looking for town records, right? It should be in the old newspaper section. You can look over there. Rachel thanked her, feeling a strange sensation settling in her chest. She went to the archives where she spent hours going through old newspapers and documents. As she read, a disturbing picture began to form. About 100 years ago, a strange cult had settled in the mountains, using the land to perform rituals supposedly meant to purify the air. There were vague records of people going missing at the time and stories about human sacrifices. The cult believed that the land and the air needed blood to remain pure. The name of the house where Rachel now lived appeared in some of the records as the place where these rituals had taken place. The house was older than she had imagined, built on sacred grounds of the cult, which believed that the weight of the souls of those who were sacrificed still resided there. In the very air they breathed, Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. The voices she had been hearing, could they be from those people? Victims of the rituals still trapped in the earth waiting for something? She wrote down what she could but knew she needed more answers. That same afternoon, Rachel decided to stop by Tom Haggerty's house, the old neighbor who lived a few miles away. Tom was one of the few people still living in the area, and from what she knew, he had been there for a long time. When Rachel arrived at his door, Tom greeted her with a suspicious look. He let her in, but his reluctance was clear. After a brief conversation, he finally admitted that he knew more than he let on. You have to leave that house, he said in a low voice, that land. It's not natural, it never was. They did things up there, things that trapped souls in the earth, in the air, and anyone who lives there ends up feeling the weight of it, as if the very air is suffocating you. Rachel went pale, but why? What did they want? Tom shook his head. They believed that sacrifice kept the balance between the world of the living and the dead, and now, the souls of those who were sacrificed remain trapped in that air. It's the weight of the evil that was done there, and you can't escape it. Tom Haggerty's words echoed in Rachel's mind the entire way back home. The idea that the souls of the dead could be trapped in the air around her was absurd, wasn't it? And yet the suffocating feeling she had been experiencing in recent days was so real, so intense, that she began to doubt her own sanity. When she entered the house, she felt the familiar weight in the air increase as if something invisible rushed to meet her. The walls seemed closer, and the darkness in the corners of the living room crawled like a living presence. She closed the door and stood there, listening to the heavy silence. The whisper came back, fainter this time, but constant. Like a breath in the background of the house, David was sitting on the couch, flipping through some catalogs of materials for the renovation. He looked up and smiled when he saw her come in, but the smile quickly faded when he noticed the pale expression on Rachel's face. Are you okay? He asked, frowning. Rachel hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything she had discovered, the sacrifices, what Tom had said. But something stopped her. David had already made it clear that he thought all of this was the result of stress. If she started talking about souls trapped in the air, he might think she had completely lost her mind. And maybe he would be right. Yes, I'm just tired, she replied, forcing a smile. David seemed to accept the answer, turning his attention back to the catalogs, but Rachel knew she wouldn't be able to ignore the truth much longer. That night, Rachel was overtaken by restless sleep. She woke up several times, sweating and gasping, feeling an unbearable pressure on her body, as if the air was being sucked from her lungs. She would sit up in bed, trying to breathe deeply, but the feeling of suffocation didn't go away. One of those nights, she woke from a nightmare in which she was buried alive, the weight of the earth on her compressing her chest, crushing her breath. When she opened her eyes, she felt something worse than the nightmare. The weight was still there. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over her own body, searching for signs of whatever was attacking her. She ran to the bathroom and turned on the light, looking at herself in the mirror. And there they were, bruises on her neck as if invisible hands had been squeezing her throat. Her heart raced. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on her face, but she couldn't shake the image of the marks from her mind. David found her there hours later, sitting on the bathroom floor, her eyes fixed on the mirror. Rachel, what's happening to you? He asked, genuinely concerned. There was anguish in his voice, a mix of frustration and despair at not being able to help her. She shook her head, speechless, and pulled up the sleeve of her shirt to show him the bruises. "I don't know. Something's attacking me. It's the air, David. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the air. It's suffocating me." David looked at the bruises, clearly shaken, but he still tried to find a rational explanation. "You must have hurt yourself while you were sleeping. Maybe you're dreaming about this and your body reacts." Rachel knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just stress, and it wasn't something she was imagining. It was real, and the house was doing this to her. In the following days, Rachel could barely sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the weight intensified, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, sucking every last bit of air. She began seeing things moving in the corners of her vision, shadows that disappeared as soon as she looked directly at them, and the voices. The voices were with her all the time now, whispering things she didn't want to hear, memories of things she had tried to forget. The air in the house was killing her slowly, in a way David would never understand. Rachel could no longer ignore the suffocating feeling that surrounded her, as if the house itself was alive, with the air compressing around her with every breath. The constant weight kept her in a state of vigilance, unable to rest, unable to feel safe. David, concerned, suggested they leave for the weekend, but Rachel knew that running away wouldn't solve the problem. She felt, with a chilling certainty, that the source of the evil was inside the house, and somehow, it was connected to her. It was a silent afternoon, the kind of silence that imposes itself and seeps into the mind. Rachel was alone, tidying up the living room, when something caught her attention. An inescapable sensation led her to the basement door, which she had avoided since they moved in. The door's hinges were rusted, and the knob made a rough sound as it turned. The basement was dark, and the smell of dampness filled her lungs, making the air feel even heavier. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, hesitating, as if something invisible was waiting for her down there. The darkness seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own, but Rachel knew she had to go down. If she wanted answers, she needed to face whatever was hidden in the depths of that house. With each step she took, the weight in the air increased. Her lungs felt more compressed, and the pressure in her head intensified, making her thoughts confused and vague. The basement was larger than she expected. The faint light from the bulb revealed stone walls, old and covered in moss. There were old furniture and dusty boxes scattered on the floor. But what caught Rachel's attention was a wall at the back of the basement. There, in the center, an opening seemed to have been sealed with bricks. But over the years, the cement had deteriorated. Something about that wall called to her, a kind of magnetic attraction, as if an invisible force was pulling her closer. She approached, her heart pounding. She felt she was about to discover something horrible, something that would change everything. When she touched the bricks, the cold stone sent a shock through her body. There were strange symbols carved there, marks she didn't recognize, but they echoed in her mind as if they had been etched into her soul. With effort, Rachel began removing some of the loose bricks, her hands trembling as she pulled pieces from the wall. When she finally created a gap, even heavier, suffocating air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the rancid smell of iron and earth. She instinctively recoiled, but something inside the hole caught her attention. At the back of the small hidden chamber, she saw a metal box. The object seemed out of place, as if it had been sealed there, never to be found. Rachel hesitated, but curiosity was stronger than fear. With trembling hands, she pulled the box out. There was a name engraved on the rusted surface: Margaret Hale. Rachel didn't know that name, but something about it felt deeply familiar, as if she had heard those words in a dream, or a nightmare. When she opened the box, the smell of oxidized metal made her recoil again, but inside there was only a collection of aged papers and small personal items. A silver chain, a worn-out diary, and what appeared to be a photograph of a woman, perhaps Margaret Hale herself. Rachel carefully leafed through the diary's pages, and the words she read began filling the blank spaces in her mind. The woman, Margaret, had been one of the victims sacrificed in the cult's rituals. She had been forced to be part of something she didn't understand. Her blood spilled to purify the land and the air. Her last words, written hastily, spoke of unbearable pain and an invisible weight she felt pressing on her body, the air around her becoming scarcer and scarcer, until silence. Rachel closed the diary with trembling hands. It all made sense now. The weight, the suffocation, the voices. She wasn't crazy. The souls of those people sacrificed and imprisoned by the evil of that cult were still there. They hadn't escaped, they were trapped, and somehow she was the only one who could hear them. But the house didn't just want her to listen. It wanted something more. It wanted to consume her the same way it had consumed Margaret Hale and so many others. Rachel stood in the basement for a long time, holding Margaret Hale's box in her hands. The air around her felt heavier than ever, as if the very space was trying to suffocate her. Every breath was a battle, and she knew with terrifying certainty that whatever was trapped there wouldn't let her go so easily. When David came home that night, Rachel finally told him everything she had discovered. She talked about the cult's rituals, the souls trapped in the air of the house, and the constant suffocating feeling she had been experiencing since they moved in. David listened in silence, but his expression was one of pure skepticism. "Rachel, it's a lot to process," he said, trying to be gentle. "I know you're going through a hard time, but you yourself said you haven't been sleeping well. It could all be piling up. Maybe we should go back to the city for a while, rest, we can leave tomorrow morning." Rachel wanted to scream that it wasn't just in her mind, that something was truly wrong with that house, but she was too exhausted to argue. Somehow David would convince her she was imagining it all, and deep down, a part of her almost wanted him to be right. Almost. The next morning, they packed some clothes and got ready to leave. As David loaded the suitcases into the car, Rachel took one last look at the house. She should have felt relieved to leave, but instead she felt nervous. It was as if something was watching her, waiting. Just waiting for her to move away. The air around her seemed to vibrate with invisible tension. "Come on, Rachel," David called from the car, the engine already running. "It'll be good to get out of here for a while." She gave one last look at the basement window from the living room, with the feeling that something down there was still watching her. Even so, she got in the car, and David started driving. They rode in silence for several miles, the surrounding forests finally fading into the distance. Rachel felt the pressure in her lungs ease a little as they moved farther away, and for a brief moment, she believed they might escape it. But then something changed. They were on a deserted road with the town still miles away, when Rachel began to feel the air around her grow heavy again. She straightened up in her seat, trying to take a deep breath, but the weight returned. That same suffocating feeling, as if the very oxygen was being drained from the car. "David," she whispered, her voice failing. "It's happening again." David glanced at her, concerned. "What is it? What are you feeling?" "It's the air, the same weight. It's here. With me." Rachel was taking short, rapid breaths, struggling against the crushing sensation. She looked around at the open field surrounding the car, but it seemed like the weight she felt was coming from inside, not outside. David slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road, alarmed by Rachel's sudden change in behavior. "Hey, calm down. It's okay, we're far away from the house now. What do you want me to do? Do you want to go back? Do you want to go to the hospital?" But Rachel knew it didn't matter where they were. Running from the house wouldn't fix anything because the evil was with her. It was as if something had latched onto her skin, into her mind, something that wouldn't let her escape no matter how hard she tried. She looked out at the distant horizon, her eyes wide with terror. "It doesn't matter, David. We can't run this. This is attached to me. It doesn't matter where we go." David was silent, the engine still running, but now with an expression of disbelief mixed with fear. He knew something was wrong with Rachel, but he seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of what she was saying. "I need to go back," she said suddenly, as if an invisible force was pushing her toward the only possible solution. "I need to end this there." David hesitated. "Rachel, do you hear yourself? You want to go back there to that house after everything you've said?" She looked into his eyes, completely serious. "It's the only way. If we don't go back, this will follow us. It will follow me." David watched her for a moment, then reluctantly let out a long sigh. He knew arguing with Rachel in her state wouldn't help. "All right," he said finally, turning the car back onto the road. "If that's what you need to do, we'll go back." As David maneuvered the car and began the journey back to the house, Rachel looked in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, she had the sensation that something was sitting in the back seat, watching her. The house seemed different when Rachel and David returned. The air around it was heavier, almost suffocating, as if the house knew she had tried to leave and was punishing her for it. The wind howled between the trees, but inside the car everything seemed too quiet. David parked in the driveway but hesitated to get out. He looked at Rachel, who was pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. Rachel nodded, though she was far from feeling safe. Something inside her was pulling her back to the house, a force she couldn't understand, but that was dragging her toward the final confrontation. She felt she wouldn't have peace until she faced whatever was happening. They got out of the car and together walked to the front door. When they entered, the air wrapped around them like an invisible wall, dense and oppressive. The house was darker than when they had left, the shadows deeper, as if something was lurking in every corner. The voices Rachel had heard before were now everywhere, whispering, lamenting, begging. She could feel the presences around her, the souls that were trapped there still bearing the weight of their sacrifices. "Let's end this," she said, more to herself than to David. She walked to the basement door and David followed her, his reluctance clear. The fear Rachel felt was palpable, but there was also a strange sense of resolution. Everything that had happened, the voices, the weight, the suffocation, had led to this moment. They descended the stairs, and the basement seemed darker, more closed off, as if the very space was struggling to breathe. Rachel felt the air around her grow heavier with every step, as if something was squeezing her throat, crushing her lungs. She fought not to panic, focusing on the hidden chamber she had found before. There it was, Margaret Hale's box, still on the floor where Rachel had left it. Margaret's name faintly glowed in the darkness, as if it were a constant reminder of what had happened there. And then Rachel saw it, the altar. There was no denying the sinister purpose of that structure. It was there that the sacrifices had taken place, there that the souls had been condemned to wander, trapped in the air of the house. The voices grew louder. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear. Pain, despair, and an uncontrollable desire to be freed. David looked at her with wide eyes. "What is this? What's happening here?" "This is where it all happened," Rachel murmured, barely hearing David. "They sacrificed these people. They trapped them here in the air, and they never got out." Rachel felt the pressure around her body increase, as if invisible hands were pushing her to the ground, trying to stop her from continuing. But she knelt beside the altar, feeling the cold stone under her hands. Her fingers trembled as she touched the center of the structure, where strange symbols were engraved. It all made sense now. The weight, the suffocation, the voices, it was these souls, these victims. And somehow she had been chosen to face them, to free them. The air grew even heavier, crushing her. Rachel felt herself suffocating again, as if the very oxygen was being pulled from her body. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she wouldn't make it. But then something inside her screamed back, a force she didn't know she had, something that came from a deep place, driven by anger and pain. With one last effort, Rachel pushed Margaret Hale's box to the center of the altar and with both hands threw it to the ground. The metallic sound echoed through the basement, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to tremble, as if the house was reacting. The voices grew louder, a collective scream that echoed in the depths of her mind. Then the weight disappeared. Rachel collapsed to her knees, breathing deeply, feeling the air finally free. The voices had gone silent. The shadows around her seemed to recede, dissolving into the darkness. She looked at David, who was frozen, shocked by what had just happened. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't know if it was really over, but the suffocation was gone. The souls, at least for now, had been freed. The house was eerily quiet now. The air, which had once felt dense and oppressive, filled with whispers and laments, was calm. Rachel and David slowly climbed the stairs, both in shock from what they had just experienced. Rachel felt exhausted, as if the effort of freeing those souls had drained her last bit of strength. But at the same time, she felt relief, as if she could finally breathe properly. David helped her sit on the living room couch while he looked around, as if expecting something else to happen. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face a mask of concern. Rachel nodded. Though she wasn't entirely sure, the air was lighter, yes, but something inside her said the weight hadn't completely disappeared. There was a strange calm in the house, a silence that wasn't comforting but rather unsettling. "I think we're done here," David said, trying to sound confident, but Rachel could hear the nervousness in his voice. "Maybe it's time to leave for good." She agreed, and the two of them began packing the few things they had brought to the house. Despite the apparent tranquility, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. It wasn't the same overwhelming feeling as before, but a light presence almost imperceptible, like a shadow lurking in the corner of her vision. As they loaded the car, Rachel took one last look at the house. Somehow she knew they would never return. What had happened there would stay in their memories forever, but it was something they needed to leave behind. Still, a part of her felt connected to the place, as if the weight of the air had left an invisible mark on her. When they got in the car and started driving down the road, Rachel watched the house fade away in the rearview mirror. She had expected to feel relief, a sense of freedom, but instead, her heart felt heavy in her chest. The air inside the car was lighter, but not completely. As the car moved forward, Rachel looked out at the landscape ahead, trying to focus on what lay ahead, on the future they could finally have. But for a brief moment, she felt something strange. It was almost as if there was a light weight on her shoulders, a subtle pressure in the air around her. She glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. In the reflection of the glass for an instant, she saw an indistinct figure in the house's window, a vaguely human shadow watching her. Still, it was quick, like a mirage, but deeply disturbing. Rachel turned to look back at the house, but they were already too far away, and all she could see were the trees closing in around the road. "Rachel?" David called, noticing her expression. "I'm fine," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. The air felt lighter, but that shadow in the rearview mirror, that subtle presence, lingered somewhere in the back of her mind. Even away from the house, even far from those mountains, something about her was still there. A part of her soul, maybe, or something else. David took her hand and smiled, relieved to finally leave everything behind, but Rachel knew that somehow the weight of the air would never completely abandon her.